The acrid smell of sulphur burns your nostrils as you peer into the shadowy undercroft beneath Parliament, where 36 barrels of gunpowder wait like sleeping demons in the flickering candlelight. This moment would reshape England forever, turning a failed Catholic conspirator into history's most infamous would-be terrorist. Quick favor. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is there. It helps us see the global reach of this story. November 5th, 1605. The night air cuts through Westminster like a blade, carrying whispers of treason through the cobbled streets. Deep beneath the House of Lords, in a stone vault that reeks of dampness and decay, a man calling himself John Johnson tends his deadly cargo with the patience of a gravedigger. His weathered hands move methodically among the wooden barrels, each one packed with enough explosive force to reduce Parliament to rubble and ash. The conspirator has waited here for days, sleeping fitfully on a straw mattress, eating cold bread, and rehearsing the moment when he would light the fuse that would send King James, his lords, and the entire Protestant establishment to their graves. But tonight, something feels different. The shadows seem to shift without cause, and every footstep echoes with unnatural loudness in the stone corridors above. At midnight, the heavy oak door creaks open. Torchlight spills into the vault, revealing not the face of a fellow conspirator, but the stern visage of a Westminster magistrate flanked by armed guards. John Johnson straightens slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward the slow match coiled at his belt. For a heartbeat, the two groups face each other in silence, separated by enough gunpowder to level half of London. But what happens when a man who has spent months preparing for martyrdom suddenly faces capture instead of glory? The magistrate's voice cuts through the tension like a blade. "Sir, what business have you here at this hour?" Johnson's response comes steady and practiced. He claims to be a servant of one Thomas Percy, with legitimate access to the vault for storing his master's coal and firewood. His calloused hands gesture casually toward the barrels, each one a miniature apocalypse wrapped in iron hoops and oak staves. The magistrate's eyes narrow as he steps closer, noting the suspicious quantity of fuel and the stranger's overly calm demeanor. The search that follows unfolds with agonizing deliberation. Guards prod the barrels with their halberds, testing their weight and construction. One soldier tears away a canvas covering, revealing not coal but the telltale grey granules of gunpowder spilling from a cracked container. The discovery spreads through the vault like wildfire through dry timber. Barrel after barrel containing enough explosive to obliterate everything within a quarter-mile radius. Johnson's composure finally cracks as shackles snap around his wrists. The metal feels ice cold against his skin, but not as cold as the realization that his holy mission has crumbled into capture and inevitable interrogation. His fingers probe the hidden compartments of his clothing, searching for the small vial of poison he carries for just such a moment. But the guards have already begun their systematic search. As they drag him from the vault, Johnson takes one last look at his abandoned arsenal. In the torchlight, the gunpowder glitters like black sand on a distant shore. All those months of planning, all those whispered prayers for God's blessing on their righteous cause, reduced to evidence in a treason trial. The weight of failure settles on his shoulders, heavier than the iron chains. The journey to Whitehall passes in a blur of hostile faces and shouted accusations. Word of the discovery spreads faster than plague through London's twisted streets. Church bells begin tolling across the city, not in mourning but in celebration of a catastrophe averted. Citizens pour from their houses, some crossing themselves in gratitude, others demanding immediate vengeance against the captured terrorist. But the most chilling realization comes as Johnson stumbles through the palace gates, His capture is just the beginning of an ordeal that will make the Gunpowder Plot seem like a gentle prelude to the symphony of agony awaiting him. The real horror would begin not with an explosion that never came, but with the methodical destruction of a human body in service of extracting truth from unwilling flesh. The stone walls of Whitehall Palace seem to press closer, with each echoing footstep, as guards drag you through corridors that have witnessed the rise and fall of kings. What unfolds in these chambers will determine not just one man's fate, but the future of Catholic resistance in Protestant England. November 6th, 1605. Dawn breaks grey and merciless over London as the prisoner who calls himself John Johnson finds himself thrust into a world of velvet-draped power and calculating minds. The interrogation chamber in Whitehall reeks of old wood polish and newer fear, a scent that has permeated these walls since the days of Thomas More's questioning under Henry VIII. Robert Cecil, 1st Earl of Salisbury, arranges himself behind an oak table that gleams like dark water in the candlelight. His diminutive frame belies the razor-sharp intellect that has made him the most feared spy master in Europe. Beside him sit other members of the Privy Council, their faces carved from granite and skepticism. They have gathered not merely to question a captured terrorist, but to unravel what they suspect is a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of Catholic society. The prisoner stands defiant despite his shackles, his weather-beaten face betraying nothing of the turmoil within. When Cecil's cultured voice cuts through the silence with the simple question of his name, the response comes without hesitation. John Johnson, a servant to Thomas Percy. The lie rolls off his tongue with practiced ease, yet something in his eyes suggests the interrogators that this performance will not last long. But how does a man maintain a false identity when facing the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in Europe? Cecil has spent decades perfecting the art of extracting truth from unwilling subjects. His questions begin gently, almost conversationally, probing the prisoner's background, his employment, his movements in recent weeks. Each answer is recorded by a clerk whose quill scratches against parchment like tiny claws. The interrogation stretches through the morning hours, a deadly dance between hunter and prey. Johnson's responses remain consistent, but oddly generic, the kind of biographical details that could apply to any working man in London. He speaks of his service to Percy, his knowledge of the Undercroft, his legitimate reasons for being present with such quantities of gunpowder. Yet, with each passing hour, the inconsistencies in his story begin to accumulate like cracks in a dam. Cecil's expertise lies not in dramatic confrontation, but in patient erosion. He circles back to previous answers, noting subtle variations in detail. He produces documents and letters, watching Johnson's face for micro-expressions of recognition. The prisoner's hands, still bearing the calluses of manual labor, begin to tremble almost imperceptibly as the net of evidence tightens around him. The afternoon brings new players to the deadly game. Other Privy Council members arrive with fresh intelligence gathered from raids across London. Names of suspected conspirators fill the air like incense: Thomas Wintour, Robert Catesby, Thomas Percy himself. With each name, Johnson's facade of ignorance becomes harder to maintain. His jaw tightens, his breathing grows shallow, and the practiced calm begins to crack like ice under spring sun. What happens when a man realizes that his carefully constructed lies are crumbling faster than he can repair them? The moment comes when Cecil produces a letter bearing Percy's seal. Not the innocuous correspondence of master and servant, but something far more damning. Johnson's eyes widen for just an instant before he recovers his composure. But that fraction of a second tells the interrogators everything they need to know. The questioning intensifies as evening shadows lengthen across the chamber. Multiple voices assault the prisoner simultaneously, overlapping questions designed to confuse and contradict. Johnson's responses become shorter, more defensive, peppered with longer pauses as he struggles to maintain his fabricated identity. Sweat beads on his forehead, despite the November chill, and his hands clench and unclench behind his shackles. Yet still he refuses to break. Hours of relentless questioning have failed to produce the confession Cecil desperately needs. The Privy Council members exchange meaningful glances, their frustration evident in the set of their shoulders and the tightness around their eyes. They have extracted suspicions and inconsistencies, but not the detailed admissions required to uncover the full scope of the conspiracy. As the bells of Westminster chime midnight, Cecil makes a decision that will transform this war of words into something far more visceral and terrible. Rising from his chair with deliberate slowness, he approaches the prisoner until they stand close enough to share breath. His next words fall like a death sentence. Perhaps John Johnson will prove more forthcoming after he has experienced His Majesty's hospitality in the Tower. The colour drains from the prisoner's face as the full implications of those words sink into his consciousness like poison into a wound. The Tower of London looms before you like a stone nightmare, its ancient walls blackened by centuries of blood and betrayal echoing with the screams of the condemned. Here, in England's most feared fortress, the methodical destruction of a human soul would begin with the stroke of a royal pen. November 7th, 1605. The barge carrying the prisoner cuts through the Thames like a funeral cortege, its oars slapping against water that reflects the tower's grim silhouette in fractured pieces. John Johnson, though that name grows thinner, with each passing hour sits chained between guards, whose faces show the professional indifference of men accustomed to delivering human cargo to places from which few return unchanged. The tower's watergate yawns open like the mouth of some primordial beast, swallowing boat and passenger into shadows that seem to have weight and texture. Stone walls weep with dampness that never fully dries, and the air carries the accumulated misery of centuries, the ghost scent of fear, desperation, and slow death. Every footstep echoes with unnatural loudness as the prisoner is dragged through corridors that have witnessed the final hours of queens and archbishops, traitors, and saints. The cell awaiting him measures barely 8 feet square, carved from living rock and furnished with nothing but straw that reeks of previous occupants. A single barred window, set high in the wall, admits just enough grey light to reveal the scratched messages left by earlier prisoners. Final words, desperate prayers, and crude calendars marking days that stretched into eternity. The heavy door slams shut with a finality that seems to compress the very air, leaving the prisoner alone with the weight of stone and the growing certainty of what awaits. But miles away in Whitehall Palace, King James sits in his private study, reviewing intelligence reports that paint an increasingly disturbing picture of Catholic conspiracy. The discovery beneath Parliament was no isolated act of madness, but part of a coordinated plot that might reach into the highest levels of English society. With this understanding comes a terrible decision that will transform investigation into systematic brutality. How does a king justify ordering the torture of a fellow human being? James's pen hovers over parchment as he considers the warrant that will authorize his interrogators to extract truth through agony. The document, when completed, reads with chilling bureaucratic precision. Begin with gentler methods of persuasion, escalating gradually to the worst if the prisoner continues his stubborn silence. The royal signature that follows carries the weight of absolute authority and the promise of unimaginable suffering. The warrant reaches the Tower with the speed of official urgency. carried by a messenger whose horse arrives foam-flecked and steaming in the November cold. Within hours, the prisoner finds himself dragged from his cell to a chamber that exists at the intersection of architecture and nightmare. The torture room stretches into shadows that seem to swallow light, its walls lined with devices whose purposes become horrifyingly clear upon examination. The interrogation begins again. But this time, the questions carry new weight. Thomas Fenwick, the tower's most experienced questioner, arranges his tools with the methodical precision of a surgeon preparing for delicate work. Manacles hang from chains anchored deep in the stone walls, their metal surfaces polished smooth by countless struggling wrists. The prisoner's eyes fix on these instruments, with growing comprehension of their purpose. "Your name, if you please," Fenwick requests with the courtesy of a gentleman asking directions. The response comes as before: John Johnson, in service to Thomas Percy. But now each lie carries a price measured in increments of agony. The manacles close around the prisoner's wrists with mechanical precision, their weight dragging his arms above his head until his toes barely touch the stone floor. What happens to the human mind when pain becomes not just sensation but environment? The first hours of hanging test the limits of physical endurance as gravity transforms the prisoner's own weight into an instrument of torture. His shoulders begin to separate from their sockets with a grinding sensation that penetrates bone deep. Breathing becomes labored as the position compresses his lungs, each inhalation requiring conscious effort. The questioning continues in cycles, each session punctuated by periods of hanging that grow progressively longer. Fenwick maintains his professional detachment, noting physical responses and recording the prisoner's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain his fabricated identity. But the human body has limits that even the strongest will cannot overcome indefinitely. By the third day, the first cracks appear in the prisoner's resolve. His voice, when he speaks, carries new undertones of exhaustion and desperation. The lies begin to shift slightly, small inconsistencies creeping in as pain clouds his ability to maintain perfect recall of his fabricated biography. Fenwick recognizes these signs with the expertise of long practice, knowing that the moment of breaking draws near. Yet the prisoner's final secret, his true name and the full scope of the conspiracy, remains locked behind barriers of faith and fear that simple hanging cannot breach. The time has come for the rack, and with it, the systematic destruction of a human body in service of political truth. The rack stretches before you like a wooden altar of agony, its pulleys and ropes designed for one unholy purpose: the methodical separation of human joints until truth spills forth with screams. This medieval engine of confession will break more than bones. It will shatter the last barriers, protecting the identities of every conspirator in England. November 9th, 1605. The torture chamber's newest resident lies strapped to a device that represents 4 centuries of refined human cruelty. The rack's wooden frame, polished smooth by countless struggling bodies, extends the length of a man with ropes and pulleys arranged at head and foot. What distinguishes this instrument from simple execution is its terrible patience, the ability to inflict maximum agony while preserving life long enough to extract every secret hidden in a prisoner's mind. Thomas Fenwick approaches the mechanism with the reverence of a craftsman examining his finest tool. His hands test the tension in the ropes with professional expertise, ensuring the proper calibration between confession and catastrophic injury. The prisoner watches these preparations with eyes that have moved beyond fear into something approaching resignation. 3 days of hanging have already begun the process of physical breakdown. The rack will complete what gravity started. The first turn of the wheel produces a sensation unlike anything in human experience. The prisoner's arms and legs stretch beyond their natural limits as iron links translate rotational motion into linear force. Joints that have held firm for 35 years begin to separate with audible pops that echo through the stone chamber like breaking kindling. The pain transcends mere sensation, becoming an environment that fills every corner of consciousness. "Your name," Fenwick requests again, his voice carrying the endless patience of water wearing away stone. The response comes as before, "John Johnson." But the words emerge broken by gasps and punctuated by involuntary groans. Another quarter turn of the wheel transforms defiance into something more fragile and desperate. But what happens to identity itself when pain becomes so overwhelming that self-preservation overrides even the deepest convictions? The rack operates on principles more fundamental than loyalty or faith. It speaks directly to the animal brain that prioritizes survival above all abstract concepts. Each turn of the wheel strips away another layer of civilized pretense until only the raw instinct to make the agony stop remains. The second hour brings visible changes to the prisoner's body. His shoulders dislocate with wet sounds that make even Fenwick wince involuntarily. Arms stretch beyond their normal length as ligaments tear and muscles separate from bone. The prisoner's face has taken on the waxy pallor of a corpse, slick with sweat that reeks of fear and metabolic breakdown. Still, through lips that have begun to bleed from biting, comes the same fabricated name. Fenwick pauses the session to allow a physician to examine the prisoner's condition. The tower's medical man probes joints and tests reflexes with clinical detachment, determining how much additional stress the human frame can endure before permanent damage becomes inevitable. His verdict arrives with brutal efficiency. The prisoner can survive several more turns before critical structures fail completely. The resumption of torture brings new dimensions of agony, as already damaged joints are stretched beyond any natural limit. The prisoner's breathing becomes rapid and shallow, interrupted by animal sounds that bear little resemblance to human speech. His fingers, once capable of delicate work with gunpowder and fuses, now curl into claws that scrape uselessly against the wooden frame. What finally breaks is not the prisoner's body, but something deeper and more fundamental, the psychological architecture that holds identity together under extreme stress. The moment arrives without dramatic fanfare, marked only by a change in the quality of his screaming. Between one breath and the next, the lies that have sustained him for 4 days simply end. "Guy," he whispers, the word barely audible above the creaking of rope and wood. Guy Fawkes. The name falls into the chamber's silence like a stone dropped into deep water. Fenwick's hand freezes on the wheel as he recognizes the moment every torturer learns to identify the instant when resistance collapses entirely. The prisoner's eyes have taken on the glassy look of someone whose connection to their former self has been severed as cleanly as a sword stroke. The confession that follows pours forth in a torrent of names, dates, and locations. Guy Fawkes. For that is finally his true identity, reveals the conspiracy's scope with the desperate eagerness of a man offering pieces of his soul in exchange for cessation of agony. Robert Catesby, Thomas Wintour, Thomas Percy, John Wright. Each name represents another Catholic gentleman who will soon face the same terrible choice between truth and torment. But even as Fenwick records these precious intelligence, he notices something disturbing about the prisoner's attempts to sign his confession. The hand that once guided delicate clockwork and measured precise quantities of explosive now shakes so violently that holding a quill becomes an act of supreme concentration. The signature that finally appears on the parchment tells its own story of nerve damage and muscular destruction, a scrawled mockery of human writing that will serve as physical evidence of what the rack can do to flesh and bone. Your broken signature sprawls across the confession like the final death throes of a spider, each trembling letter a testament to what the rack has stolen from your body. This document will condemn not just Guy Fawkes, but every Catholic conspirator whose names now bleed from tortured lips onto government parchment. November 10th, 1605. The Tower's corridors echo with urgent footsteps as messengers carry copies of Fawkes's confession to every corner of England. What began as the capture of a single terrorist has exploded into the largest manhunt in the kingdom's history. His broken testimony names 13 conspirators, their locations, their safe houses, their Catholic allies, a roadmap written in agony that will guide the king's agents to every remaining thread of the conspiracy. Robert Cecil's network responds with mechanical precision. Armed riders thunder through the November countryside, their horses' breath steaming in the cold air as they race toward manor houses and tenant farms where the remaining plotters have taken refuge. The confession extracted from Fawkes's ruined body becomes a weapon more devastating than any gunpowder, reaching into the heart of Catholic England with surgical accuracy. Meanwhile, in his cell, deep within the Tower's bowels, Fawkes exists in a twilight world between consciousness and delirium. The rack has left him barely recognizable as the man who tended gunpowder barrels just days earlier. His arms hang at unnatural angles, the shoulders permanently dislocated and held in place only by torn ligaments and shredded muscle. When he attempts to move, waves of agony crash through his nervous system like lightning strikes, leaving him gasping and whimpering in the fetid straw. The Tower's physician makes his rounds with clinical detachment, probing the prisoner's injuries with the same professional interest he might show examining a specimen in an anatomy theater. Fawkes's fingers, once capable of delicate timing mechanisms and precise measurements, now curl into permanent claws. The nerve damage extends from his fingertips to his neck, creating zones of numbness interspersed with areas of hypersensitive pain where even the lightest touch feels like molten metal. But what price does the human mind pay when the body becomes a landscape of constant torment? Sleep offers no escape, as dreams dissolve into nightmares where the rack's wheel turns endlessly, and phantom ropes stretch his limbs beyond breaking. In his waking hours, Fawkes finds his thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm, unable to focus on anything beyond the immediate reality of his shattered flesh. The psychological damage proves as systematic as the physical destruction. Months of planning and preparation, years of religious conviction, decades of personal identity, all reduced to fragments by 4 hours on a wooden frame. When guards bring thin gruel that passes for prison food, Fawkes cannot hold the bowl steady enough to feed himself. They watch with morbid fascination as this former soldier, this man who had fought in continental wars and handled explosives with steady hands, struggles to perform the basic functions of survival. News filters into the Tower of the Conspiracy's complete collapse. Thomas Wintour captured at Holbicher House, wounded but alive. Robert Catesby and Thomas Percy shot dead while resisting arrest. John Wright found with his skull split by a government bullet. Each update brings fresh waves of despair to the broken prisoner, who realizes that his weakness under torture has doomed every man who trusted him with their lives. How does a devout Catholic reconcile his faith with the betrayal torture forced from his lips? Fawkes spends long hours attempting prayer, but the words seem to stick in his throat like broken glass. The God he served so faithfully has allowed him to become the instrument of his friend's destruction. Every name he revealed under the rack's influence represents not just political intelligence, but personal betrayal of men who considered him a brother in faith. The weeks that follow blur into a haze of pain and degradation. Tower guards grow accustomed to the smell emanating from Fawkes' cell, a mixture of infection, human waste, and the sweet scent of flesh, slowly rotting while still attached to living bone. His left leg, damaged during the rack session when restraints cut off circulation, develops the telltale discoloration of gangrene. The tower's physician considers amputation but decides the prisoner's survival until trial takes precedence over preserving the limb. Visitors to the tower during this period leave disturbing accounts of what they witness. Foreign ambassadors, permitted to observe conditions as part of diplomatic protocol, describe a creature barely recognizable as human. Fawkes' hair has turned prematurely grey. His eyes have sunk deep into their sockets, and his skin has taken on the translucent quality of aged parchment. When he speaks, which occurs rarely, his voice emerges as a whisper, barely distinguishable from the sound of dry leaves scraping against stone. The psychological torture proves as methodical as the physical destruction. Guards read aloud accounts of his companions' deaths, describing in vivid detail how Robert Catesby died clutching a picture of the Virgin Mary, or how Thomas Percy's last words cursed the man whose confession led to their doom. Each revelation drives deeper wedges into Fawkes' fractured psyche, until he begins to question whether survival itself constitutes another form of betrayal. Yet through all this systematic degradation, something deep within the broken prisoner clings to a core of identity that even the rack could not entirely destroy. As January's bitter cold seeps through the tower's stones, that remnant of Guy Fawkes prepares to face the final act of his transformation from terrorist to martyr. The trial that would seal his fate and create his legend waited just weeks away. Westminster Hall stretches before you like a cathedral of judgment, its ancient timbers groaning under the weight of centuries as England prepares to formally condemn its most notorious terrorist. This trial will transform a broken prisoner into a legal precedent, establishing the template for how the Crown deals with enemies of the state. January 27th, 1606. The Great Hall of Westminster Palace fills with the anticipation that precedes all public executions. Lords and commoners pack the galleries like spectators at a bear baiting, their breath forming clouds in the winter air as they crane their necks to witness history in the making. The hall itself seems to pulse with accumulated authority. These same stones have witnessed the trials of Sir Thomas More, the Earl of Essex, and countless other traitors whose names now decorate the margins of legal precedent. Guy Fawkes enters this theatre of justice as barely more than a living corpse. Guards support him on either side, his legs too damaged from months of imprisonment to bear his weight independently. The man who once moved with a soldier's confident stride now shuffles like an invalid, each step sending visible shockwaves of pain through his broken frame. His clothing hangs loose on a body that has shed 30 pounds of muscle and fat, transforming him into a scarecrow dressed in the remnants of human dignity. The crowd's reaction to his appearance ripples through the hall like wind through wheat. Some spectators cross themselves at the sight of what torture has wrought, while others lean forward with the morbid fascination of those witnessing a public dissection. Fawkes' face, once weathered but strong, now resembles a death mask carved from yellowed bone. His eyes, sunken deep into their sockets, seem to focus on some distant point beyond the immediate reality of his circumstances. Lord Chief Justice Popham presides over the proceedings with the ceremonial gravity befitting England's highest criminal court. His black robes seem to absorb light from the hall's tall windows, creating the impression of a judge shaped from shadow and legal precedent. The formal charges, when read aloud, transform the conspiracy from political adventure into criminal fact. high treason against His Majesty King James, conspiracy to murder the monarch and his parliament, and the attempted destruction of the established government of England. But how does a man whose body has been systematically destroyed find the strength to respond to questions of law and loyalty? When asked to enter his plea, Fawkes struggles to remain upright long enough to speak. His voice, when it finally emerges, carries the hollow quality of wind through broken stones. He whispers, the single word falling into the hall's silence like a stone dropped into deep water. The simplicity of that admission transforms what might have been a dramatic trial into a foregone conclusion. Fawkes offers no defense, presents no mitigating circumstances, makes no appeal for mercy. His lawyers, appointed by the Crown more for legal formality than genuine advocacy, exchange helpless glances as their client systematically destroys any possibility of avoiding the ultimate penalty. The broken prisoner seems almost eager to embrace his fate, as if death represents release from the unbearable burden of continued existence. The evidence against him unfolds with mechanical precision. Court clerks read aloud his tortured confession, their voices echoing through the hall as they detail every aspect of the conspiracy. Each revelation, the meetings at the Duck and Drake Tavern, the renting of the house beside Parliament, the months spent digging beneath the building, transforms past events into present condemnation. Fawkes listens to this recitation of his own words with the detached interest of a man hearing someone else's biography. Physical evidence follows testimonial proof. The court examines the signature comparison that tells its own story of what the tower's hospitality can accomplish. Fawkes's confident autograph from before his arrest stands in stark contrast to the trembling scrawl he managed after the rack completed its work. The deterioration visible in those few pen strokes serves as more powerful testimony than any witness statement about the reality of royal justice. What strikes observers most powerfully is not the prisoner's guilt, which was never in question, but his complete absence of defiance or regret, where they expected to see the burning eyes of a religious fanatic or the desperate pleading of a man facing death. They find only the vacant stare of someone whose connection to his former self has been severed as cleanly as a hangman's knot. The Guy Fawkes who planned to blow up Parliament died somewhere in the tower's torture chambers. What stands trial is merely the residual flesh that once housed that man's ambitions. The sentencing, when it comes, surprises no one familiar with English law regarding high treason. Lord Chief Justice Popham's voice carries the weight of centuries as he pronounces the traditional formula: to be hanged by the neck until half dead, then cut down alive, disemboweled while conscious, beheaded and quartered, with the pieces displayed at locations throughout the realm as warning to other potential traitors. Fawkes receives this news of his approaching dismemberment with the same vacant acceptance he has shown throughout the proceedings. But as guards prepare to escort him back to the tower for his final days, something flickers briefly in his sunken eyes, not fear of death, but perhaps recognition that his torment will soon reach its appointed end. The execution, scheduled for January 31st, would test whether any remnant of the man who had once defied a kingdom still survived within his broken shell. Old Palace Yard spreads before you like an amphitheater of death, its cobblestones slick with January frost and the anticipation of thousands who have gathered to witness justice. This final act will transform Guy Fawkes from failed terrorist into eternal symbol, his death echoing through centuries in ways his life never could. January 31st, 1606. Dawn breaks grey and pitiless over Westminster as the tower's gates swing open to release their most notorious prisoner for his final journey. The scaffold erected in Old Palace Yard stands 15 feet high, its freshly hewn timbers still weeping sap in the morning cold. Around its base, a crowd has gathered with the festive atmosphere that attends all public executions, vendors hawking hot pies and mulled wine, pickpockets working the pressed bodies, children perched on their fathers' shoulders for better views of the approaching spectacle. Guy Fawkes emerges from the tower more dead than alive. His broken body strapped to a hurdle that will drag him through London's streets like a side of beef bound for market. The wooden frame scrapes against cobblestones with a sound that sets teeth on edge, each bump and pothole sending fresh waves of agony through joints that have never properly healed from their encounter with the rack. His clothing, once the practical garb of a working man, now hangs in tatters that barely preserve the basic dignity of human coverage. The procession moves through streets lined with faces that range from savage anticipation to horrified fascination. Some spectators cross themselves as the hurdle passes, recognizing in Fawkes' condition a preview of what awaits all who challenge royal authority. Others lean forward with morbid curiosity, trying to reconcile the broken thing before them with the man who had nearly reduced Parliament to smoking rubble. Children stare with the frank interest of those too young to understand the full implications of what they witness. The sheriff's men surrounding the hurdle maintain professional composure despite the crowd's escalating bloodlust. They have performed this duty countless times before, shepherding condemned traitors through their final hours with the mechanical efficiency of men who understand that spectacle serves political purposes beyond mere entertainment. Each shout from the crowd, each thrown stone or rotten vegetable, reinforces the message that defying the crown carries consequences too terrible for ordinary imagination. But what thoughts occupy the mind of a man being dragged to his own dismemberment? Fawkes drifts in and out of consciousness as the hurdle bumps through Westminster's narrow lanes, his damaged brain struggling to process the reality of his situation. Pain has become his constant companion, a familiar presence that drowns out almost everything else. Yet somewhere beneath the layers of physical agony and psychological collapse, a small flame of the man he once was still flickers. The scaffold, when it finally looms into view, represents both culmination and release. Its gallows arm extends like a wooden finger, pointing toward whatever exists beyond mortal judgment, while the butcher's block and array of knives below promise a more immediate and visceral reckoning. The crowd's roar increases as guards lift Fawkes from the hurdle, his legs too weak to support his weight without assistance. The climb to the scaffold platform tests the limits of human endurance. Each step requires conscious effort as Fawkes forces his ruined body up the ladder's rungs, guards supporting him on either side to prevent a premature fall. His breathing comes in ragged gasps that steam in the cold air, and observers close enough to see his face note the waxy pallor of approaching death. The man who once moved with a soldier's confident stride now struggles to manage the simple mechanics of placing one foot above another. The sheriff reads the formal charges one final time, his voice carrying across the packed yard as he recites the catalogue of treasons that have brought this morning to its inevitable conclusion. High treason against His Majesty, conspiracy to destroy Parliament, attempted regicide each charge, punctuated by fresh roars from the crowd that has come to witness justice in its most primitive form. Yet as the hangman approaches with his rope, something unexpected happens. Fawkes, summoning reserves of strength that should not exist in his broken body, speaks his final words with surprising clarity. "I ask forgiveness of God and the King." The statement carries across the yard with the authority of genuine conviction, momentarily silencing the baying crowd as they confront the humanity of the man they have come to see destroyed. What happens next unfolds with terrible swiftness as the noose settles around his neck and the hangman prepares to push him from the ladder. Fawkes makes one final choice in a life that has been stripped of all other options. Gathering his remaining strength, he leaps from the scaffold with enough force to snap his neck cleanly, denying the executioner the opportunity to cut him down alive for disemboweling and quartering. The crowd's reaction splits between cheers for the successful conclusion and disappointed groans from those who had anticipated watching him suffer the full penalty for treason. But the sheriff's duty remains unchanged by the prisoner's final act of defiance. Royal justice demands completion regardless of the condemned man's condition, and the sentence will be carried out in its entirety. The butcher's work that follows transforms what remains of Guy Fawkes into something beyond human recognition. His quartered remains destined for display throughout the kingdom as final testimony to the fate awaiting all who challenge the crown's authority. Yet in choosing the manner of his death, Fawkes achieved something the rack could never destroy: one last assertion of will in the face of absolute power.